Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. As you know, I've been sharing my personal horror stories with you, and today I have a new one that I believe will give you goosebumps. This story happened to me a few years ago, and I still can't shake off the terror that I felt that night. So sit back, grab a blanket, and let's get started. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and my siblings were staying over at a friend's house. I was in my bedroom, scrolling through my phone when I heard a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, and it sounded like someone was walking in the hallway. As I slowly opened the door, the creaking sound echoed through the silent hallway, adding to the eerie atmosphere. My heart was pounding so loud that I was sure the figure would hear it. But I had to know what was out there, and I couldn't let fear consume me. As I peeked out, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was almost like it was waiting for me. I squinted my eyes, trying to make out any details, but it was too dark. All I could see was the silhouette of a woman in a long dress. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that this wasn't a normal occurrence. I was alone in the house, and there should be no one else there. And yet, here was a figure that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The figure started to move closer, and I could feel the coldness of its presence. It was like a blast of icy air that washed over me, making me feel numb. My mind was racing with fear and confusion. Was this a ghost? A figment of my imagination? Or was it something more sinister? As the figure came closer, I could see that its eyes were fixed on me, and it was almost like it was drawing me in. I was frozen with fear, unable to move a muscle. All I could do was watch as the figure closed in on me. It was then that I realized that I was not alone in the house. And I had no idea what kind of horrors awaited me. Without thinking, I turned around and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and pushed a chair against it, hoping it would hold. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold my phone. I knew I had to call for help, but who would believe me? I dialed my parents' number, hoping they would pick up, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic set in as I realized I was on my own. I couldn't stay in the house, but I couldn't leave either. I was trapped, and the only thing I could do was wait for help to arrive. I decided to call a friend who lived nearby, hoping they could come to my rescue. As I waited for them to arrive, the noises outside my room grew louder. It sounded like something was scratching at the door, trying to get in. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I was convinced that the figure was trying to get in, and I didn't know how long the door would hold. The scratching turned into pounding, and it felt like the door was going to break any second. But then, a miracle happened. I heard a knock on the front door, followed by my friend's voice calling out my name. The pounding and scratching stopped, and the figure disappeared. My friend came into the room, and I collapsed into their arms, crying with relief. We quickly gathered our things and left the house, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I never felt safe in that house again. It was a horror story that I wish I could forget, but it will always stay with me. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. It could have been a ghost, a demon, or my own imagination. But I know that it was real, and it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was some kind of electrical malfunction that caused the strange noises and the figure to appear. But deep down, I knew that something supernatural had occurred. I talked to my friends and family about the experience, but no one had any logical explanation for what I had witnessed. Some of them thought that it was just a prank or a hallucination, while others believed that it was a warning of some kind. After that night, I had trouble sleeping and had nightmares about the figure coming back to haunt me. I became obsessed with researching paranormal activity and haunted houses, trying to find answers to what had happened to me. I visited psychics and mediums, hoping that they could shed some light on the situation. But nothing seemed to help. Eventually, I moved out of that house and into a new one, but I never forgot about the experience. It stayed with me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain. I often wonder if the figure was trying to tell me something, or if it was just a lost soul searching for something in our world. Maybe it was a warning of some kind, or maybe it was just a random occurrence. But one thing is for sure, I will never forget that night, and it will always be a part of my life. I hope you enjoyed this story, and if you have any similar experiences, please share them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more horror stories based on my personal experiences. And remember, always be aware of your surroundings, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night that makes you want to stay indoors and curl up with a good book. But I had promised my friend that I would house sit for her while she was away on vacation, and so here I was, alone in a large and creaky old house. At first, everything seemed fine. I made myself some tea and settled down on the couch to watch TV. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was as if there was someone else in the house with me, someone who was watching me from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling and distract myself with a book, but then I heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one else in the house. My heart began to race as I realized that I might not be alone after all. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw a figure materialize in front of me. It was a ghost, pale and transparent, with a face twisted in a grotesque expression. I froze in terror, unable to move or even scream. The ghost seemed to be staring straight at me, as if trying to communicate something. But I was too terrified to understand what it wanted. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air. I was left alone, shaking and gasping for breath. It took me a long time to gather the courage to leave the safety of the couch and check the house for any signs of intruders. But when I did, I found nothing. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and anxiety. I didn't sleep at all, and as soon as the sun began to rise, I packed my bags and left the house, vowing never to return. It wasn't until much later, after I had talked to my friend and done some research on the house's history, that I learned the truth. The ghost that I had seen was said to be the spirit of a woman who had died in the house many years ago, and who had never been at peace. Her ghostly presence was still felt by those who entered the house, and it was said that she would only appear to those who needed her help. Despite the terror that I had felt that night, I couldn't help but wonder if the ghost had been trying to communicate with me. And as I looked back on my terrifying encounter, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had been given a gift that few others had ever received, a chance to glimpse the other side. As I thought back on my experience with the ghost, I couldn't help but wonder why it had appeared to me. Was it trying to communicate something to me? Or was it just a random encounter that had no significance at all? I decided to do some research on the history of the house to try and uncover any clues. As it turned out, the house had a dark past. It had been the site of a gruesome murder many years ago, and some locals believed that the ghost I had encountered was the spirit of the victim. I dug deeper, speaking to local historians and researching old newspapers. And then, I finally found the answer I had been looking for. The woman who had been killed in the house was said to have been a kind and compassionate person who had dedicated her life to helping others. She had died in the most horrific way imaginable, and her spirit had never been able to rest. It was then that I realized that the ghost I had seen might have been trying to communicate with me. Maybe it had been reaching out for help, hoping that someone would finally be able to put its spirit to rest. I felt a sense of responsibility wash over me. I knew that I couldn't ignore what I had seen and experienced. So, I reached out to a local medium, hoping that they would be able to help me communicate with the ghost. To my surprise, the medium was able to connect with the ghost immediately. She told me that the spirit had been trying to reach out to someone for years, hoping to find someone who would be able to help her finally find peace. She had been waiting for someone like me, who was open to the idea of communicating with the other side. Over the next few days, I worked with the medium to try and understand what the ghost wanted. It was an emotional and sometimes terrifying process, but eventually, we were able to piece together the events that had led to her death. The ghost had been murdered by someone she had trusted, someone who had been jealous of her kindness and compassion. She had been trapped in the house, unable to move on, waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth of what had happened to her. With the help of the media, I was able to bring the ghost story to light. We shared it with the local community, and eventually, the murderer was brought to justice. In the end, I felt a sense of peace and closure that I had never thought possible. The ghost that had once terrified me had become a guiding presence in my life, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope for healing and redemption. It was a dark and stormy night when I had my terrifying encounter with a ghost. I had always been skeptical of the paranormal, thinking that ghosts were just figments of people's imagination. But what happened to me that night changed my beliefs forever. I was staying in an old, creaky house that had been in my family for generations. It was always a bit eerie, but I never felt scared before. However, that night was different. I couldn't sleep, and I kept hearing strange noises. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the sounds continued. Eventually, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the source of the noise, which was coming from the old attic. The attic was always locked, and I had never been up there before. I slowly turned the key and pushed the door open, but what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the corner, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Its face was pale and featureless, and it was staring directly at me. I froze in fear, unable to move or speak. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. I was face to face with a ghost. The ghost didn't move or speak, but its presence was suffocating. I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted to harm me. I slowly backed out of the attic and ran down the stairs, heart racing. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my covers, too scared to move. The next morning, I tried to tell my family what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just imagining things or trying to scare them. But I knew what I saw, and I knew that I had experienced something truly terrifying. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never went back to the attic, and I never stayed in that house again. My encounter with the ghost had changed me, and I knew that I would never be the same. My encounter with the ghost left me shaken to my core. I couldn't believe what I had witnessed, and I struggled to make sense of it all. I spent the following days trying to find a rational explanation for what had happened, but deep down, I knew that what I had seen was beyond explanation. The incident had a profound effect on me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid that the ghost was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to make its next move. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep within me. As time went on, I began to withdraw from my family and friends. I couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened, afraid that they would think I was crazy or delusional. Instead, I kept to myself, trying to process the trauma of my encounter. One day, I stumbled upon an old journal in my family's attic. The journal had belonged to my great-grandfather, who had lived in the same house many years ago. As I flipped through its pages, I came across an entry that sent chills down my spine. In the entry, my great-grandfather had written about a ghost that had haunted the house for years. According to him, the ghost was that of a young woman who had died tragically in the house many years before. She had been searching for something, he wrote, and would often appear to members of the family in the dead of night. Reading those words sent a shock through my body. It confirmed what I had suspected all along, that I had truly encountered a ghost that night. It was both terrifying and comforting to know that I wasn't alone in my experience. Armed with this new information, I began to research more about the paranormal. I read countless books on ghosts and hauntings, trying to understand the nature of what I had experienced. Through my research, I came to the conclusion that ghosts were not malevolent beings, but simply lost souls looking for closure. Eventually, I found peace with my encounter. While it had left me traumatized, it had also opened my eyes to a world beyond the tangible. I began to view life through a different lens, and I felt a sense of connectedness to something greater than myself. Years later, I returned to the old house where I had my encounter. It was empty and dilapidated, but I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I stood in the same spot where I had seen the ghost all those years before. I knew that I had come full circle, and that my encounter had helped shape me into the person I had become.